Good morning. Welcome to the next session of the Introduction to Modern Indian Theatre. For today, we will actually be discussing another very important playwright, Girish Karnad, 1938, and he turns 80 this year. So, he is another very important playwright. He also directed a few plays. Of his own plays, and he's also very important because, like many of his other contemporaries, including Badal Sarkar from Bengali, Ibrahim Al-Ghazi, and so on and so forth, B.V. Karanth, Alec Padamse. So he belonged to the first generation of playwrights post-independence, and many of his plays, as he himself puts it, had to do with the return to the cultural roots of theatre. They had to engage with this very complex negotiation between colonial forms of theatre and indigenous folk traditions. So, in many of his plays, Girish Karnad is trying to grapple with this dilemma that many playwrights of his generation had, which was that what do we do with the colonial legacy of theatre, and to what extent can there be a conversation between colonial forms of theatre and indigenous theatre traditions. So, as a playwright, as a dramatist, he drew a lot from local folk traditions, folk forms like the tamasha, the nautanki, as well as the yakshagana tradition of performance, which was prevalent in the border regions of Maharashtra and Karnataka. He was himself born in Matharan, Bombay in 1938, which was then part of the Bombay Presidency. But even though he studied Marathi in school, it was Airoli Kannada that was his major language of expression. Some of his plays, especially the ones on The Dream of Tipu Sultan, were written in English, but most of his plays were written in Kannada and then translated by him and by others into English. So, he is important in some sense as one of those early figures, playwrights who belonged to the theatre of roots movement. He may not entirely identify with the movement himself, but there are elements in his plays that suggest that he wished to draw from or incorporate certain elements of folk tradition or folk forms in his own theatre to very often introduce multiple frameworks of theatre, multiple narrative frameworks, and also in order to parody, ironize certain ideals like motherhood, like chastity, like fidelity, all these issues were in some sense parodied and ironized in his plays. So, for instance, if you look at his play on Tughlaq, right, which was written and published in 1964, again he draws on the idealist 14th century Sultan of Delhi, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, right, and that in some sense is also given a modernist twist. So, it's interesting to see how he draws from older historical figures and recasts them in a modernist idiom to talk about the idealism and the disillusionment of the Nehruvian era post-independence. Then there was this other very important play that we will be discussing today, which is Hayavadana, 1971, which is again based on a theme drawn from the transposed heads, right, which was initially, of course, a tale from the Katha Sarit Sagar, but was also then adapted into a novella by the German writer Thomas Mann, which was called The Transposed Heads in 1940. So, it was drew originally from the 11th century Sanskrit text Katha Sarit Sagar, and he also employed the folk theatre form of Yakshagana in the Hayavadana play. Then you also had another play called Nagamandala 1988, which was based on a folk tale that was recounted to him by the writer and translator A.K. Ramanujan, who in some sense brought him the Karnataka Sahitya Academy Award for the most creative work of 1989. It was directed by J. Garland Wright as part of celebrations of the 30th anniversary of the Guthrie Theatre in Minneapolis. Then the theatre that was subsequently commissioned to him was Agni Mattu Male, or The Fire and the Rain, right? And before that came Taledanda, or Death by Beheading in 1990, which again uses Veerashaivism and Basavanna, the great Veerashaiva, anti-caste Veerashaiva leader and poet who was a part of the radical protest and reform movement in 12th century Karnataka against the caste system. He has won several awards, including the Sangeet Natak Academy Award in 1972, the Padma Shri in 1974, the Padma Bhushan in 1992, the Kannada Sahitya Parishad in 1992, the Sahitya Academy in 94, the Jnanpith in 98, the Kalidas Samman in 98, and so on. Right? So he's also been part of many acted in many movies and films in Kannada and Hindi, and he has also written certain very important screenplays for films like Bhumika by Shyam Benegal and Satyadev Dubey, and he has also written scripts for certain important non-feature films in Kannada. So now let us actually move to our discussion of Girish Karnad's very important play, Yakshagana, which was imagined to be one of those paradigmatic plays which incorporated folk elements into urban theatre. Now, it's interesting to look at Hayavadana in terms of its structure and form, in the ways in which it deploys certain motifs like the Lord Ganesha in the initial phase of the play, in the initial moments of the play. It's also framed by a female chorus. You also have two anonymous actors. You have the Bhagavata, who performs the role of the Sutradhar in Girish Karnad's play Hayavadana. And you also have the central story of Padmini and her love for two men, Devdatta and his friend Kapila. When you look at when you read, if you've seen the performance of Hayavadana, which was first performed in 1973 or 71, sorry, it appears as if it is a rather traditional play that begins with an invocation to the Lord Ganesha. Now, the story itself has to do with the love that a woman has for two men, right? And in the Katha Sarit Sagar, the 11th century tale, there are slight differences between the tale, Thomas Mann's novelistic adaptation of the tale, and Girish Karnad's play Hayavadana. In the Katha Sarit Sagar, in the story that's called The Heads That Got Switched, it contains a very simple riddle. A woman is traveling with her husband and her brother when she discovers the men's decapitated bodies in the temple of Parvati, and she receives a boon from the goddess which will bring them back to life. But in the process of bringing them back to life, she switches the heads by mistake. So the resulting problem of true identity ends up having an unambiguous solution to this in this version. The one with the husband's head is the husband because the head rules the body and the person. So the personal identity depends on the head. And this of course draws from certain mythic genealogies of caste, which can be found in Manu Dharma Smritis and the Rig Veda, where the Brahmins are said to have risen out of the Purusha's head, right, man's head, while the Shudras arose from his feet. So the supremacy of the head over the body is established in the Katha Sarit Sagar, in the tale called The Heads That Got Switched. In Thomas Mann's elaboration of the story in his novella, The Transposed Heads in 1940, again there are three characters. The female protagonist Sita, ironically named Sita, is married to Sri Daman, who is a very intelligent, intellectual, aesthetic and sensitive man. But she also feels an intense physical attraction for Nanda, who is Sri Daman's friend, who is an emotionally crude and strong man, right, with a very fine physique. In the Thomas Mann version, the husband, right, Sri Daman, beheads himself in Parvati's temple out of jealousy and despair, because he realizes that his wife is actually deeply in love with his friend. And the friend, out of guilt and fear, again beheads himself when he discovers his friend's decapitated body. And the pregnant wife, Sita, who is pregnant, prepares to die in order to avoid ignominy, dishonor for herself and for the child. After the accident of the transposition of the heads, a holy ascetic grants Sita the new Sri Daman by using the same logic that appears in the folk tale. Right? But in Mann's text, the supremacy of the head is sustained and challenged beyond the point of crisis. Right? So, the new bodies of the two men change inexorably until they are compatible with their heads once again. Right? So, the bodies of the two friends also change until they are compatible with their heads. So, Sri Daman, who is an intellectual aesthete, his head lies on Kapila's body, right? In this case on Nanda's body, and Nanda's body soon loses its athleticism, its physique, and becomes soft, while the reverse happens with Nanda's head, which is on Sri Daman's delicate body, which acquires musculature over time. So, the new bodies of the two men, they change irreversibly until they are compatible with the heads once again, but the original bodies also exert their own subversive power and change the heads indefinably. So, Sita, to whom the man with the husband head and friend body has given the full enjoyment of the pleasures of sensual pleasure, for a time finds herself yearning once again for the friend who has Nanda's head and Sri Daman's body. And eventually, by the end of the novella, Sri Daman and Nanda kill each other in the forest, and Sita commits sati on the funeral pyre, leaving her 4-year-old son behind to keep alive the memory of the strange sacrifice. Right? So, this is what happens in Thomas Mann's adaptation of The Heads That Got Switched, a folk tale from the Katha Sarit Sagar. In Karnad's play, you have certain additional elements, certain additional frames to the play, which also de-orientalizes Thomas Mann's version of The Heads That Got Switched, right? Because in the heads that got in the transposed heads, there is a certain fascination with sati as an Oriental practice that testifies to the wife's fidelity to her husband. So, she punishes herself for actually betraying her desire for another man, her husband's friend. In the Karnad play on Hayavadana, there is this additional element where you have the Bhagavata, who is the narrator. Right? He is the narrator, he is the sutradhar of the play, he resonates with some of the folk sutradhars of folk plays, whose role is to very often step in, intervene in the action, engage in a question and answer session with the characters who appear on stage. Right? And in the production of Girish Karnad's Hayavadana, masks were also used as which were actually drawn from certain folk traditions of theatre, Yakshagana and others, where masks were used. So, you have, for example, Hayavadana himself, the main character, the eponymous character of the play Hayavadana, who is a horse-headed man. Right? So, he has the body of a human being, but he has the head of a horse, and he interrupts the story of the woman who fell in love with the two men. Right? And in this case, the names are Padmini, and her husband is called Devadatta, and his friend is called Kapila. So, you have Kapila, you have Devadatta, and you have Padmini. And the main story, the main plot of Padmini's love for these two men is interrupted early in the play by Hayavadana and his own story, his own past. And you also have an anonymous actor. You also have a female chorus that constantly anticipates the action of the play and very often comments on it in a tragic fashion. And you also have the use of 3 dolls in the actual production, the first production of the play in 1973, and when the play was remounted in 1989. Small children played the role of these dolls, and these dolls also wore masks, and the purpose of these dolls was to actually externalize the illicit desires and thoughts of Padmini as she's sleeping, when she begins to fantasize about Kapila after the transposition. Right? So, you have all these additional folk elements that adds to the complexity, the layered complexity of the play. So, in the Hayavadana, the play itself was performed initially in 1971 as a poster play for the emerging roots movement. It was seen to be a new dramatic form which successfully incorporated folk elements into modern urban theatre in an urban setting. In the 1972 production by B.V. Karanth, there was the use of certain traditional performance elements from Yakshagana, which is a well-known genre of dance drama performed in Karnataka. And there was a very interesting hybrid quality to the play, which made it neither Indian nor exclusively Western. Right? In some sense, Karnat wasn't interested in trying to get rid of Western elements of theatre, but was also trying to incorporate certain folk elements to produce a play which could not be reduced to either of these two categories of Western and Indian. In Hayavadana, the play focuses again on Padmini, who is attracted to Kapila, who is her very intellectual husband Devdatta's friend. Right? And Kapila has an athletic physique, and he is also the son of a blacksmith. Padmini herself is the daughter of a merchant, and Devdatta is a Brahmin. So, there is already a prohibition on the possibility of Padmini marrying Kapila, because that would count as an intercaste marriage. Right? So, it is already forbidden, and so she marries Devdatta, who is a Brahmin. And Devdatta, who grows jealous of, who discovers his wife's desire for Kapila, grows jealous and cuts off his own head in front of the Kali temple. In fact, he even promises to offer his head to Kali if at all he should acquire Padmini as his wife. Kapila later on finds his body, and he knows that he might be blamed for Devdatta's suicide because of his own desire for Padmini, and he ends up beheading himself too. And Padmini, who is again terrified of the gossip that will ensue, because she is worried that the world might think that the two men fought over a woman who was of a sexually disreputable character, ends up on being on the verge of killing herself, stabbing herself to death. But that is when the goddess Kali intervenes and stops her from killing herself. Right? And Padmini begs for the life of the two men, and she ends up switching the heads of the two men in her eagerness to bring them back to life. And so you have, she ends up with Devdatta, her husband's body, being transposed with Kapila's head, while Kapila's body acquires Devdatta's head. And she, of course, the choice is easy to make, initially at least, that she ends up leaving with Devdatta's head and Kapila's body. Right. So she ends up with that hybrid combination of Devdatta's head with Kapila's body, while Kapila's head with Devdatta's body ends up being rejected. And like in the Thomas Mann's adaptation of the transposed heads, Padmini later on, as time passes, she realizes that her husband's body is growing soft. It has lost its athleticism because clearly the head governs the body, right? So he loses his athleticism, and he's no longer attractive to his wife, and she begins fantasizing about Kapila, whose body has also undergone a muscular transformation, right? Who's become athletic the way he used to be. And there's also the predicament of the child, because when Padmini is pregnant with her son, the question of paternity becomes a riddle which cannot be answered. So, did Devdatta's body produce the child, or did Devdatta's mind produce the child? Right. So it's not clear, right? But the difference lies here, that while Thomas Mann's novella, right, is a philosophical rendition of The Heads That Got Switched, Hayavadana places this debate, this dichotomy between mind and body, as a dichotomy between self and other, right? So while in Thomas Mann there is a battle reigns between, lasts between the head, the intellect, and the body and its emotions. In the Hayavadana, the dichotomy between the opposition between mind and body is couched as a dichotomy between self and other, which is placed within the social and political context of post-independence India. So the Bhagavata, who is the Sutradhar of the play, the narrator or singer, as he's about to introduce Padmini's story, he is interrupted by an actor who runs on stage yelling that he has just seen a talking horse, right? And no one believes it. They are incredulous and they wonder how a horse can talk. The shocked actor swears that he saw a horse talking to him, which is when Hayavadana appears on stage, and he's wearing a horse's head or a horse's mask and a man's body. And they still don't believe that he is a hybrid cross between a horse and a man, and they try to remove what they think is a mask, and they're unable to. And they realize that the mask is the actual real face.
आप कौन हैं और यहाँ क्या कर रहे हैं? तुम?
हाँ।
कहाँ?
हाँ, मेरा बेटा नहीं जानता था कि नदी के साथ कोई कैसे हंसता है, ठंडी हवा में कोई कैसे कांपता है, पाँव में कांटे कैसे चुभते हैं। तुम वो सब दिखाने के लिए आए। मैं जंगल में भटक गई।
लेकिन इतनी दूर नहीं भटकना चाहिए।
गलत राह पाँव से छूटी छुटकी रही।
इतनी दूर नहीं भटकना चाहिए था। यहाँ तरह तरह के खतरे, जंगली जानवर, चोर, लुटेरे, राही, रास्ते।
सब लोगों से राह पूछती है, गांव वालों से, शिकारियों से, वनवासियों से, कभी कभार अपने मन से, लेकिन सबने यही कहा गलत राह छूटे नहीं, छूटते रहे।
मेरी नहीं, उस दिन नहीं माना था पद्मिनी, लेकिन आज मानता हूँ। मैं कपिल हूँ।
कैसा है कपिल? दिखाने के लिए तो आई हूँ।
मुझे क्या हो गया? इतनी दूर से आई और अब तक बैठने को भी नहीं पूछा। जाओ, अंदर विश्राम कर लो।
ठीक है। नहीं, जरूरत नहीं।
कैसी हो?
अच्छी हूँ। रोग, ताप, चिंता, कष्ट कुछ नहीं। विरक्ति हो गई है। इसे क्या क्यों सताया? जब ये शरीर तुम्हें मिला था तो कितना कोमल था। किसी राजकुमार के शरीर की तरह ये बाहें कितनी पतली और पीली। अब इन्हें देखो, क्या हाल बना रखा है तुमने अपना?
जब ये शरीर मुझे मिला था, तब ये मेरे सिर से लटकती लाश की तरह था। ब्राह्मण की उजली दुर्बल काया जंगलों के लिए नहीं बनी। दौड़ता तो घुटने दुखने लगते, कुल्हाड़ी चलाता तो हाथ थक जाते। ये शरीर मेरे किसी काम का न था। जिस दिन ये शरीर मुझे मिला, उसी दिन मेरे और इसके बीच युद्ध छिड़ गया।
कौन जीता?
मैं।
हमेशा मस्तक ही जीतता है ना?
हाँ पद्मिनी, अब इसे भाग्य समझो। जब कोसों दौड़ सकता हूँ, बरसाती बाढ़ में भी कूद कर तैर सकता हूँ, बड़े से बड़ा पेड़ गिरा सकता हूँ। पहले पेट साथ नहीं देता था, मगर अब जो भी मिले पचा लेता, ना मिले तो भी रोता नहीं।
क्या हमेशा मस्तक ही जीता करेगा?
इसलिए मैं कपिल हूँ, ऐसा कपिल जिसका शरीर उसके मस्तक से मेल खाता है।
कपिल देवदत्त, कपिल देही देवदत्त, देवदत्त शरीरी कपिल, जन्म एक पुरुष चाहे।
तुम उसे क्यों छोड़ आई?
तुम्हें कैसे समझाऊं?
तुम यहाँ क्यों आई?
तुम्हें देखने।
क्यों? जब मैं अपने आप से जूझते ये समझ बैठा था कि मैं जीत गया हूँ, तब तुम क्यों यहाँ आई? जब मैं जैसे तैसे करके उन यादों को मिटा सका था, तो क्यों तुमने मेरा पीछा किया? मैं कपिल हूँ, जंगली बेरहम कपिल। अपना जाल यहाँ मत लगा, चली जाओ देवदत्त के पास, वही तुम्हारा पति है इस बच्चे का बाप। देवदत्त और पद्मिनी अग्नि की साक्षी से बंधी जोड़ी, जहां मेरी कोई जगह नहीं, कोई शांति नहीं, कोई मुक्ति नहीं। मैं कहता हूं
जाती हूँ, तुम कहते हो तो जाती हूँ।
ईश्वर,
क्या हुआ?
और एक याद।
क्या थका हुआ है, सोया है बेचारा, उसे थोड़ी देर सोने दो, उसके जागते ही चली जाऊंगी। तुम जीत गए कपिल, देवदत्त भी जीत गया, लेकिन मैं दो शरीरों की अरदास में नहीं, मेरे लिए ना जीत है ना हार। नहीं 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 कपिल, कुछ मत कहो, मैं जानती हूँ क्या कहोगे। मैं तुमसे 1000 बार कह चुकी, भूल मेरी ही थी, मैंने ही सिरों की अदला बदली मैंने ही, जिसका फल अब मुझे भुगतना है, मैं ही भूल भूल हुई जो इतनी दूर आने से पहले सोचा नहीं। हाँ सोच ना सकी, पर जब इतनी दूर आ ही चुकी हूँ तो बच्चे के जाने तक तुम्हें आग पर देख लूं, बस कुछ बोलूंगी नहीं, चुपचाप बैठी तुम्हें देखती रहूंगी।
हम बैठी रहो या चली जाओ, कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता, क्योंकि बिगाड़ जो होना था सो हो ही गया। उन यादों को कहीं अपने अतल में दबा रखा था, जिन्हें तुमने नाखूनों से फिर से कुरेद किया है।
कुछ भी क्यों दबाया जाए?
क्यों नहीं? इस अधूरेपन के पाल और नाच को क्यों झेला जाए?
कौन सा अधूरापन?
अपना।
तुम्हारा?
हाँ, शरीर को चाहे जितना भी दबाओ, उसकी यादें नहीं मिलती। आश्चर्य की बात है, इस शरीर की भी अपनी यादें होती हैं, छूने की याद, किसी स्पर्श की याद, किसी को बाहों में भरने की, इस हथेली में दबे किसी गर्म देह की याद, जो मिटती नहीं, जिन्हें मिटाया नहीं जा सकता, क्योंकि ये सब जब हुआ तब ये सिर्फ नहीं था।
कपिल,
क्यों आई? तुम आई, मुझे छुआ और इस शरीर को तुम्हारे स्पर्श की याद हो आई। मैंने तुम्हें नहीं छुआ, पर ये निर्लज शरीर तुम्हारे स्पर्श पाकर ही खिल उठा, जैसे अब किसी पुराने साथी को गले लगा लिया हो।
बेचारे कपिल,
दया मत दिखाओ।
चुप रहो कपिल, तुम्हारे शरीर ने किसी नदी में स्नान किया, सुख भोगा, तो क्या ये तुम्हारे सर को नहीं जाना चाहिए कि वो नदी कौन सी थी, उसका बहाव कैसा था, उसका प्रवाह तुम्हारी कानों को सराबोर कर दे, उसकी जीभ तुम्हारे कानों में गूंजे। जब तक ये सब तुम्हारे साथ नहीं होता, तुम अधूरे ही रहोगे कपिल।
मेरे लिए तो पेट का मतलब पेट, आकाश का अर्थ आकाश ही था, मगर तुम्हारे शरीर ने मुझे नई चेतना, नए शब्द दिए। ऐसी चेतना मैंने पहले कभी महसूस नहीं की, और सहसा मैंने 2-3 कविताएं भी घसीट डाली। बेशक ही निकम्मी थी, मगर अब मुझे उन सबसे घृणा है, तुम्हारे शरीर ने।
मैं तुम्हारा बल चाहा, जंगली पर नहीं। तुम घृणा में जिया और मैं
भय में तो मैं जिया।
बदला बदली, हेरा फेरी, बोल बता दे कौन हारा। एक बात बताओ,
पूछो।
क्या तुम सचमुच पद्मिनी को चाहते हो? और मैं भी
जानता हूं देवदत्त, क्या ऐसा नहीं हो सकता साथ है, द्रौपदी और पांडवों की तरह।
इसीलिए जो अपने आप नहीं मिटता उसे काट डालना चाहिए।
ये तुम्हारी
कहाँ है तुम्हारी तलवार? सच पूछो तो आज इस बात का कोई महत्व नहीं कि तलवार चलाने में कौन सा कुछ समझ नहीं आता। इसीलिए आज दया करुणा की कोई जगह नहीं, न स्नेह की न मित्रता की। चूसना है शेरों की तरह, मारना है सांपों की तरह। ये क्या? ये दृश्य देखकर तो रक्त दसों में ही जम जाए। क्या बात है बेटी, कोई सहायता चाहिए?
हाँ, चाहिए सहायता। मेरा बेटा भीतर झोपड़ी में सोया है, आप उसे संभाल लो और यहाँ के शिकारियों को सौंप देना। कहना कपिल का बेटा है, कपिल उनका मित्र था, वे उसकी अच्छी तरीके से पालन करेंगे और 5 वर्ष बाद उसे विप्रोत्तम विद्यासागर के पास धनपुरी उससे उन्हें धन और ज्ञान दोनों मिलेगा।
और तुम?
मेरे लिए एक विशाल जगह बनवा दो, हम 3 जगह।
हे भगवान, सती होगी।
प्रसिद्ध रहा है, मगर जिस प्रकार पद्मिनी सती हुई उस प्रकार शायद ही कोई अन्य स्त्री हुई हो। फिर भी आज तक कोई नहीं जानता कि पद्मिनी कहां सती हुई। जंगल के शिकारियों से पूछो तो वे जंगल के बीच एक हरा भरा सुहाग के फूलों का वृक्ष बताते।
अगले दिन हम फिर एक नई कथा के साथ यहीं उपस्थित होंगे।
तुम लोग
हैवदन कहाँ है? तुम लोग के साथ गया था हैवदन।
हम नहीं जानते, जैसे ही चित्रकूट पहुंचे हैवदन ने हमें भगा दिया।
और ठहरने नहीं दिया।
बेचारे, माँ काली उस पर प्रसन्न हो। ये बच्चा कौन?
ओह, ये बता बेटा, तू कौन है?
तुम कौन हो बेटे? तुम्हारा नाम क्या है? तुम्हारे माँ बाप कहाँ के?
ना हंसता है ना बोलता, दिन भर से एक चुप्पा बांधे पर गंभीर पड़ा हुआ है ना।
लगता है जब बड़ा होगा तो अच्छा नाट्य समीक्षक बनेगा।
तुम्हें कहाँ से मिला?
चित्रकूट से लौटते समय एक रात शिकारियों की बस्ती में ठहरा था। वहाँ एक शिकारी की स्त्री ने इस बच्चे को हमारे शौक पर कहा, इस शिकारियों की संतान नहीं, धर्मपुरी का बालक है।
धर्मपुरी का बालक?
ये धर्म, ये नट, रुको, एक बात याद आ गई। वही तिल, ये हो ना हो, ये पद्मिनी का बच्चा है।
पद्मिनी कौन?
हाँ, पद्मिनी।
भारत जागे तब चरने माथा। अरे दिव्य भव्य, आप सब एक साथ, नमस्कार।
है बधान।
मैं जोर से चिल्लाया, काली माँ मुझ पर प्रसन्न हो जा, वरना मैं तेरे ही चरणों की काटने हैं तो कहीं और जाकर क्यों नहीं काटते? बार बार मेरी नींद चौपट करते हो। मैंने तुरंत देवी के चरण पकड़े और बोला, माँ मुझे पूर्णांग बना दे माँ। देवी बोली तथास्तु। और अभी मैं कह भी ना पाया था कि माँ मुझे पूरा मनुष्य बना दे, देवी बड़ी जमाई के साथ अंतर ध्यान हो गई। दुख की बात एक ही है।
क्या?
अरे घोड़ा तो हूँ पर अभी भी पूर्णांग नहीं हूँ। कमबख्त ये इंसान की आवाज जैसे गले से चिपक गई है। जब तक इस इंसानी बोली से पीछा नहीं छूटता बाबा, तब तक मैं पूर्णांग कैसे कहलाऊंगा बाबा? ये बोली कैसे छूटे बाबा, ये बोली कैसे छूटे?
समझ नहीं आता क्या कहूँ।
बच्चा ठीक कहता है, रोने से गला नहीं फट जाएगा। हंसू? नहीं बच्चे, हुक्म पर हंसी नहीं आती, बड़ी मुश्किल है। बैठ जाओ। अरे गुदगुदी नहीं
So his story, Hayavadana's story, offers another perspective on the divided self, right, which frames the central plot of the play by appearing both at the beginning and at the end of the play. Hayavadana is trying to unite his body and his head, and this dilemma between the body and the head is expressed in terms of nationalism and Indianization, which is why Hayavadana says initially, I took an interest in the social life of the nation, civics, politics, patriotism, nationalism, Indianization and the socialist pattern of society. Right? That's what he tells the Bhagavata. But where is my society? Where? You must help me become a complete man. So by the end of the play, Hayavadana is desperate to become a complete person. Right? And of course, he then chooses to transform himself entirely into a horse. But he's unable to actually lose his voice. So even though he's almost able to transform himself into a horse, he's unable to lose his voice. And his voice by the end of the play is also silenced and stifled. All he can do by the end of the play is to recite the national anthem. And this again becomes a remark on the politics of nationalism, the exclusionary politics of nationalism, and the deep sense of disillusionment that the youth feel, the once idealistic youth of pre-independence India feel post-independence. So the entire romanticism of the freedom movement is lost once independence is won and once reality strikes. So the Hayavadana is himself the child of a princess and a celestial being who takes the form of a horse, who then after 15 years of marriage is miraculously transformed back into his celestial form. So he is the a product of miscegenation of this cross species breeding between a princess and a horse. And he comes from two worlds, two different worlds, human and animal, but he feels like he belongs to neither of these two worlds. So he again represents the divided self of the post-colonial subject, a character who is attempting to try and decolonize his own mind. So he tries to invent himself as a fully Indian subject by participating in the most simple demonstration of patriotism, which is to appear at the end of Act 2, where he manages to become a full horse but still has a human voice, which he's trying to lose by singing patriotic songs like Vande Mataram or Sare Jahan Se Acha or Jhanda or Jana Gana Mana. So Hayavadana is a very comic figure, right? And he's a foil to the more tragic Devdatta and Kapila, whose inability to deal with their own head body divide leads to their deaths. Another interesting frame element, folk element in the play is also the deity Ganesha. So even though the play is initially an invocation to the god Ganesha, he just appears as he would during these invocatory pujas. Right? So there is the audience gets a darshan of Ganesha initially in the play, but it's not clear whether Ganesha is really a god. Does he play a god on stage? Right? Is the audience led to believe that he is a god on stage, or is he merely just an idol, just a figure, right, which invokes divinity, but is not really a part of any ritual process, right? So it's not like as though puja is being performed before Ganesha, even if he is being invoked in order to bless the performance of the play. And it's interesting that Girish Karnad should have introduced Ganesha in the play, because Ganesha himself is a hybrid product. If you remember how Ganesha is formed, he's formed when from sandalwood paste that Parvati smears on a body, right? And she molds the paste in the form of a young boy who then becomes her son, and he is given the responsibility of guarding the entrance to her quarters as she's having a bath. And when Lord Shiva appears to meet his wife, Ganesha refuses to let him enter, right? I mean, on the strict orders of his mother. But Shiva is enraged, wondering who this impertinent boy is to interrupt or to come in between him and his consort, and he ends up beheading Ganesha, much to the rage of his mother. And finally, Shiva has no choice but to place the head of the first living being that his followers encounter in their process of trying to find a new head for Ganesha. And of course, they find an elephant, they behead the elephant, and they place the elephant's head on Ganesha. And it's interesting that Ganesha is also being worshipped today as a hybrid product, not as a human being, but as a hybrid product, someone who rises above his physical identity as a human being or as an elephant. So he's being acknowledged as a hybrid. So the initial invocations to Ganesha in the play Hayavadana suggest that the irony of Ganesha, that in some sense Ganesha is he's believed to be on one hand the god of completion, of perfection. He is an auspicious god who is the remover of obstacles to any new task that has to be accomplished, and yet he is himself imperfect. He has one broken tusk, and he sits on a mouse, and he is decorated with a snake. And so the Bhagavata, who is commenting on the placing of Ganesha at the beginning of the play, is not able to understand how is it that someone who looks incomplete can be the god of completion, of perfection. And he tries to rationalize that by saying that perhaps it's the limitation of human knowledge itself that doesn't allow us to understand the mystery, the power of divinity, of Ganesha. So in the beginning of the play, Hayavadana recounts his own past as the product of a princess and a celestial being who takes the form of a horse. And then ultimately, when the princess is married to the white stallion, she lives with him for 15 years, and it's only after that that the celestial being reassumes his original form. And after he is released from his curse, the Hayavadana's father asks his mother to accompany him to his heavenly abode, but she refuses, and she offers to come to heaven with him only if she is blessed to become a horse, if he becomes a horse again, right? Because she's only in love with the horse and not with the man, right? And so he curses her to turn into a horse. So the princess herself turns into a horse, and she escapes. She runs away, and so the child is only left behind. And in a rather humorous conversation with the Bhagavata, Hayavadana, again, Girish Karnad is also trying to poke fun at the pieties of not only nationalism but also of religion and Hinduism, because Hayavadana tries to seek redemption from various holy Hindu holy places like Banaras, Rameshwaram, Gokarn, Haridwar, Gaya, Kedarnath and so on, and is not able to find any kind of redemption, purification from these different places because he is unable to actually transform himself completely into a human being or a horse. Right? So, he is condemned to remain in that hybrid state as half horse and half man. Then the play recounts the story of Padmini and her love for the two men, and how in her love for the two men she accidentally ends up transposing the heads of Kapila and Devdatta. Right? So, unlike many of the urban realist plays that we see in L. Kanchwar, Mahesh L. Kanchwar or others, here Vijay Tendulkar for example, here because Karnad employs many folk elements, there is the possibility of making fun of or parodying certain pieties, certain social and sexual norms like motherhood and female chastity. Right? So, the supposedly accidental transposing of the heads of the two men would suggest that Padmini, the woman here, desires both. Right? So, it's her desire for the two men is also left rather clear and ambiguous. It's betrayed, it's suggested in later in the first and second act, when the three dolls end up externalizing Padmini's own sexual fantasies and thoughts and her longing for Kapila. The female chorus also anticipates the illicit desire that Padmini has for Kapila. So, the female chorus sings, "Why should love stick to the sap of a single body? When the stem is drunk with the thick yearning of the many-petaled, many-flowered lantana, why should it be tied down to the relation of a single flower?" And later on, the female chorus again sings, "A head for each breast, a pupil for each eye, a side for each arm. I have neither regret nor shame. The blood pours into the earth and a song branches out in the sky." Again anticipating Padmini's illicit desire for Kapila and the dilemma that she faces as a married woman who desires another man. So, later on in the play, when Devdatta recounts his encounter with this gorgeous woman called Padmini, he is unable to describe his beauty except in very conventional metaphors drawn from Sanskrit erotic literature and poetry. Often compares her to a lotus. Of course, the Karnad is also trying to make fun of the conventions of Sanskrit poetry, when Kapila echoes and repeats and anticipates Devdatta's similes and metaphors to describe Padmini's beauty. So, for example, he says Devdatta is known to be a poet, to be an aesthete, but then clearly his poetry is not authentic or original. He seems to be imitating earlier classical poetry. How can I describe her? Devdatta says to Kapila, "Her forelocks rival the bees, her face is," and this is all very familiar to Kapila, and he joins in with great enjoyment. They both repeat together, "is a white lotus. Her beauty is as the magic lake. Her arms the lotus creepers. Her breasts are golden urns, and her waist," and so on and so forth. Devdatta is desperate to identify and find Padmini and ask for her hand, but he doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know how to identify her. He doesn't have the courage to find her. So, he actually sends Kapila to find her, and Kapila is more than willing to do anything for Devdatta out of his own loyalty and love for Devdatta. So, when Kapila identifies Padmini's house on a street called the Pavana Vidhi, the street of merchants, he finds a double-headed bird on the door of Padmini's house, and he is not able to identify what bird it is. No matter how much he peers at it, he doesn't know whether it's an eagle or a lotus or a lion or a tiger, right, or a wheel. He is completely perplexed by the shape and form of the knob on the door. Padmini enters, and what ensues is a rather funny conversation that resonates with certain Nautanki traditions where the woman in the Nautanki play is outwitted. But here it's slightly different because you have a similar fast exchange between Kapila and Padmini, but here Padmini proves to be a very witty woman, unlike her rather unoriginal and husband Devdatta. So when Kapila first sees Padmini, he falls in love with her beauty, and he says, I give up Devdatta. He's talking to himself. I surrender to your judgment. I hadn't thought anyone could be more beautiful than the wench Ragini who acts Ramba in our village troupe. But this one, you're right, she is Yakshini, Shakuntala, Urvashi, Indumati, all rolled into one. Padmini says, you knocked, didn't you? Kapila, yes. Padmini, then why are you gaping at me? What do you want? Kapila, I just want to know whose house this was. Padmini, whose house do you want? Kapila, this one. Padmini, I see. Then who do you want here? Kapila, the master. Padmini, do you know his name? Kapila, no. Padmini, have you met him? Kapila, no. Padmini, have you seen him? Kapila, no. And this is an interesting reversal of what actually happens in the Nautanki, where it's the woman who is constantly saying no to a man who is not a husband, who is trying to make amorous overtures to her and is trying to make love to her, and ends up saying no when she actually means yes, or ends up saying yes when she actually means no. But so here it's just a direct reversal when to Padmini's questions, Kapila constantly says no, no, until he actually means yes. Padmini, so you haven't met him, seen him or known him. What do you want with him? Kapila, aside to himself, she is quite right. What have I to do with him? I only want to find out his name. Padmini, are you sure you want this house, or were you? Kapila, no, I'm sure this is the one. Padmini, pointing to her head, are you all right here? Kapila, taken aback, yes, I think so. Padmini, how about your eyes? Do they work properly? Kapila, yes. Padmini, showing him 4 fingers, how many? Kapila, 4. Padmini, correct. So there's nothing wrong with your eyes. As for the other thing, I'll have to take you on trust. Well then, if you're sure you wanted this house, why were you peering at all those doors? And what were you mumbling under your breath? Right? So, and finally, of course, Kapila has no choice but to tell him that he is here on behalf of his friend Devdatta, which is when Padmini discovers the real reason for why he is here, and she runs away bashfully because she realizes that he has come on behalf of his friend to ask for a hand in marriage. The Bhagavata, as the Sutradhara of the play, always appears at moments in the play when it's not possible for the characters themselves to express or speak. Right? So there's a point when, after the match has been made between Padmini and Devdatta, the Bhagavata steps in to say that this could only have been the most logical and natural conclusion, right? Because this is the only way in which a marriage could have been possible, because Padmini could never have married Kapila, who was the son of a blacksmith. Right? So a legitimate union would be between Padmini, the daughter of a merchant, and Devdatta, who is a Brahmin. Need one explain to a wise and knowing audience what followed next? Padmini is the daughter of the leading merchant in Dharmapura. In her house, the very floor is swept by the goddess of wealth. In Devdatta's house, they have the goddess of learning for a maid. What could then possibly stand in the way of bringing the families together? Padmini became the better half of Devdatta and settled in his house. Nor did Devdatta forget his debt to Kapila. The old friendship flourished as before. Devdatta, Padmini, Kapila, to the admiring citizens of Dharmapura, Rama, Sita and Lakshmana. Right? So it seems as though Kapila has been reduced to the status of a brother-in-law. Then they decide to go on a trip to the Kali temple, but Devdatta is very reluctant to go on a trip with Kapila, because he's unable to find any time alone with his wife, because Kapila is always with them. He's always intervening, he's always interrupting, he always wants their company. So he's trying to get rid of Kapila, despite the fact that he loves Kapila as his own friend. And at this point in the play, Padmini is already pregnant, right, expecting their first child. So they decide to go to the Ujjain fair on a bullock cart, and on the way they stop at a temple. The road, the journey to the fair is on a very bad road, right? There are lots of potholes and rocks, and they have to stop because Padmini is pregnant and they're worried about her health and the health of the child. And they stop in front of a temple. On the journey, Padmini admires Devdatta as he rides the cart. She also admires his muscles, much to Devdatta's own jealousy. When she asks him to bring her a flower that they discover on the way. It's called the Fortunate Lady's flower. It's a beautiful flower that Padmini wants, and she asks Kapila to climb the tree and bring her those flowers, and that is when she ends up admiring his physique. And Devdatta, who was jealous at the sight of his wife's desire for Kapila, decides to give up his life. Now, it seems as though Devdatta wants to give up his life because he had promised to offer his head to the goddess Kali if ever Padmini were to become his wife. But it also becomes clear that it's being done out of sheer insecurity and jealousy. So he says, to addressing the goddess, he says that, give me strength. In fact, it's a temple to goddess Kali, and he prostrates himself before the goddess and he says, Bhavani, Bhairavi, Kali, Durga, Mahamaya, mother of all nature, I had forgotten my promise to you. Forgive me, mother. You fulfill the deepest craving of my life. You gave me Padmini, and I forgot my word. Forgive me, for I am here now to carry out my promise. So all the characters seem to, in some sense, conceal their true intentions for what they do, and what they apparently seem to be doing, what they apparently seem to be saying or claiming, does not match with their own unconscious, secret insecurities and jealousies and desires. Great indeed is your mercy. Even in this lonely place, some devotee of yours, a hunter perhaps, or a tribesman, has left this weapon. Who knows how many lives this weapon has sacrificed to you? And so, saying that, he beheads himself with a sword. And Padmini and Kapila are waiting for him, and after a while they begin to wonder where he is. And she sends Kapila to go in search of him, and Kapila goes, and when he discovers that his friend has beheaded himself, he is very, very upset and laments the loss of his dear friend. And then he realizes that he would have to behead himself to spare himself from the society's censure and criticism. He says, you've cut off your head. You have cut off your head. Oh, my dear friend, my dear brother, what have you done? Were you so angry with me? Did you feel such contempt for me, such abhorrence? And in your anger, you forgot that I was ready to die for you? So I think Kapila already knows that perhaps Devdatta was resentful of and jealous of the fact that his wife desired Kapila more than him. And in your anger, you forgot that I was ready to die for you. If you had asked me to jump into fire, I would have done it. If you had asked me to leave the country, I would have done it. If you had asked me to go and drown in a river, I would have accepted. Did you despise me so much that you couldn't ask me that? I did wrong, but you know, I don't have the intelligence to know what else I should have done. I couldn't think, and so you have pushed me away. No, Devdatta, I can't live without you. I can't breathe without you. Devdatta, my brother, my guru, my friend, you spurned me in this world. Accept me as your brother, at least in the next. Here, friend, here I come. As always, I follow in your footsteps. And he cuts off his head. Now, meanwhile, Padmini is again wondering what happened to Kapila too. She goes in search of the two men, and by which time it is dark, and she's unable to see clearly, and she stumbles on the two bodies. And she again is lamentful of the two bodies that she sees, and she doesn't have the courage to behead herself, but she tries to stab herself when the goddess Kali interrupts. Now, the voice of Kali is not the voice of Hinduism, right? It's not as though Kali is again being represented as a figure of piety. Right? Again, she's a very, it's more a parody of the idea of Kali than the goddess herself. The voice says, "Hey," and Padmini freezes. Put down that sword." Padmini, "Who's that? Who's that?" And there's a tremendous noise of drums, after which Padmini shuts her eyes in terror. Right? Now, another very important element that Karnad incorporates from folk drama is the curtain. Right? So, a curtain is lowered on stage and taken away to introduce the figure of Kali, and there is a huge terrifying figure with her arms stretched out, her mouth wide open with her tongue lolling out. The drums stop and the goddess drops her arms and shuts her mouth. It becomes clear that she has been yawning, and this is exactly what the stage directions say to parody, to make fun of the solemnity, the fierce ferocity of Kali. Kali completes the yawn saying, "All right, open your eyes and be quick, don't waste time." Padmini says, "Mother, Kali." Kali, who's sleepy, says, "Yes, it's me. There was a time many years ago when at this hour they would have the Mangalarti. The devotees used to make a deafening racket with drums and conch shells and cymbals. So I used to be wide awake around now. I've lost the habit." Right? So it's almost like as if she couldn't care less. Now times have changed in the modern era. No one bothers with rituals, daily rituals, religious pieties. And so now she seems to be absolutely bored. It's almost like a very secularized version of the goddess, making fun of Hindu piety and piety itself. "Save me, mother," Padmini says. Kali says, "I know, I've done that already." And Padmini wonders why the goddess did not prevent the killings of the suicides of the two men, right? Why didn't she stop them? And Kali says, "Put these heads back on, and once they're attached properly, they will come back to life." And of course, Padmini betrays her desire for the two men, and in the excitement of bringing them back to life, ends up transposing the two heads. And when Padmini wonders why Kali did not stop the two beheadings, Kali says, "The rascals, they were lying to their last breaths." Again, Kali's voice is there to actually expose the hypocrisy, the pretense of these two men who pretend to make these large claims of piety and sacrifice, but actually end up revealing how insecure they were over their desire and love for Padmini. "The rascals, they were lying to their last breaths. That fellow Devdatta, he had once promised his head to Rudra and his arms to me. Think of it, head to him and arms to me. Then because you insisted on going to the Rudra temple, he comes here and offers his head. Nobly too. Wants to keep his word," he says. "No other reason. Then this Kapila died right in front of me, but for his friend. Mind you, didn't even have the courtesy to refer to me. And what lies. Says he is dying for friendship. He must have known perfectly well he would be accused of killing Devdatta for you. Do you think he wouldn't have grabbed you if it hadn't been for that fear? But till his last breath, oh my friend, my dear brother, only you spoke the truth." So it's interesting that the goddess says that Devdatta actually wanted to sacrifice his head to Rudra and his arms to Kali, and wasn't really interested, he wasn't really devoted to Kali herself. Kapila was really more interested in sacrificing his life to save himself from social stigma, from the accusations of having loved another man's wife, and also because of his love for his friend, ends up offering his own head. So neither of them actually seems to have any devotion for Kali, and Padmini apparently is the only one who is being true to herself, not only to the goddess but to herself, by betraying the fact that she desires both the men. Padmini says, "It's all your grace, mother." Kali says, "Don't drag me into it. I had nothing to do with it. You spoke the truth because you're selfish. That's all." Right? So she's selfish because she wants both the men. Right? And she's true. She is true that she confesses that yes, she wants both. So Padmini is initially the three characters when they come back to life after the transposition. They're all excited and happy and they laugh over the fact that they've exchanged heads. But then over time they realize what's happened, and Padmini ends up walking away with choosing the man with Devdatta's head and Kapila's body because she has the best of both worlds. So they actually ends up leaving with him, leaving the body with Devdatta's head and Kapila's body behind. There's again a huge dilemma on who is the father of the child, who is the actual husband. Is it the body, the hand that held Padmini's hand in marriage, or is it the head of Devdatta which loved her because of his poetic abilities? So who exactly is the lawful husband, and who is the lawful father of the unborn child? Is it the man, the father with the body, or the father with the mind? And there is no clear resolution to this answer at this point in the play. As time progresses, the mind begins to influence the body, right? So Devdatta, initially engages in the gymnasium in wrestling, right, which is something he's never done before because he has a strong body. But that also changes because the body begins to exert its influence on the mind, and he begins to actually lose his musculature. You also see a transformation in Padmini's desire for Devdatta, because Padmini begins to miss the manly, masculine scent of his body, as in Kapila's body. But then Devdatta has been using, he claims that he's been using sandal oil since he was a child, and Padmini says, I don't mean that. Your body had that strong male smell before, and I liked it. But when we came back from the temple of Kali, you used to smell so manly. So why have you basically started applying sandal oil when I missed that unwashed smell, which is the smell that reminds her of Kapila, right? The unwashed, sweaty smell of Kapila. And at this point, you have the three dolls who appear as a way of trying to dramatize the inner desires, the forbidden inner desires of Padmini. So the dolls are in some sense dramatizing these illicit proscribed desire within the head of married woman, and they are also very gossipy and judgmental dolls, right, who constantly judge Padmini and her son for being extremely deceptive and manipulative. Not a bad house, I would say, doll 1. Not a bad house, I would say. Doll 2 could have been worse. I was a little worried. Doll 1, this is the least we deserved. Actually, we should have got a palace, a real palace. Doll 2, and a prince to play with, a real prince. Doll 1, how the children looked at us at the fair, how their eyes glowed. Doll 2, how their mother stared at us, how their mouths watered. Doll 2, how their mother stared at us, how their mouths watered. Doll 1, only those beastly men turned up their noses. Expensive, too expensive. Doll 2, presuming to judge us. Who do they think they are? Doll 1, only a prince would be worthy of us. Doll 2, we should be dusted every day. Doll 1, dressed in silk. Doll 2, seated on a cushioned shelf. Doll 1, given new clothes every week. Doll 2, if the doll maker had any sense, he'd never have sold us. Doll 1, if he had any brains, he should never have given us to this man. Doll 2, with his rough labourer's hands, of course referring to Kapila's hands, which are on Devdatta's body. Then you also have again on page 158 the ways in which the dolls actually echo Padmini's illicit fantasies for Kapila. It says, Devdatta goes to doll 1, moves it aside and picks up the book. Doll 1 shudders. Doll 2 asks, why, what happened? Doll 1, he touched me, and doll 2, yes. Doll 1, his palms, they were so rough once when he first brought us here, like a labourer's, but now they are soft, sickly soft, like a young girl's. So the doll's function is also to register the transformation in the body of Devdatta, who is now losing his rough bruteness and has acquired the soft, effeminate body of an intellectual Brahmin. Doll 2, I know, I've noticed something too. Doll 1, what? Doll 2, his stomach. It was so tight and muscular. Now, doll 1, I know, it's soft and loose. Doll 2, do you think it will swell up too? Doll 1, holding its hands in front of its stomach to suggest a swollen belly, it will swell a little. Doll 2, holding its hands a little further in front, then more. Doll 1, even further, more, and doll 2, even further, and more until doll 1, if it's a woman, doll 2, there will be a child, doll 1, and if it's a man, doll 2, bang, they roll with laughter. So it's suggesting registering the bodily transformation in Devdatta, but it's also suggesting Padmini's growing dislike or distaste for Devdatta's increasingly body that's quickly losing its definition. A continuation of that fantasy. Doll 1, hey. Doll 2, yes. Doll 1, look. Doll 2, where? Doll 1, behind her eyelids, she's dreaming. Doll 2, I don't see anything. Doll 1, it's still hazy, hasn't started yet. Do you see it now? Doll 2, eagerly, yes, yes. Doll 1, a man. Doll 2, but not a husband. Doll 1, no, someone else. Doll 2, is this the one who came last night? Doll 1, yes, the same, but I couldn't see his face then. Doll 2, you can now. Not very nice, rough, like a labourer's, but he's got a nice body, looks soft. Doll 1, who do you think it is? Doll 2, it's fading. Remember the face. Doll 1, it's fading. Oh, it's gone. Doll 2, and she wouldn't even remember it tomorrow, and so on. That is Padmini's longing for Kapila. But what she tells Devdatta is something very different. She says, what are you afraid of, Devdatta? What does it matter that you're going soft again, that you're losing your muscles? I'm not going to be stupid again. Kapila's gone out of my life forever. I won't let him come back again. Kapila, what could he be doing now? And this is to herself. Where could he be? Could his body be fair still and his face dark? Devdatta changes, Kapila changes, and me? So while the two men seem to change, right, in their respective ways, Padmini doesn't seem to change because she still desires Kapila throughout the play. Padmini decides to take her son out on a trip to the forest, and that is where they discover Kapila after a long time. And here again, Padmini is unable to actually acknowledge her desire for Kapila openly because she's a married woman, and the Bhagavata steps in to actually speak for Padmini. He takes on Padmini's perspective, and when Kapila asks Padmini that why have you moved away from Devdatta, why have you come here, and Bhagavata says on Padmini's behalf, how could I make you understand? If Devdatta had changed overnight and had gone back to his original form, I would have forgotten you completely. But that's not how it happened. He changed day by day, inch by inch, hair by hair, like the trickling sand, like the water filling the pot. And as I saw him change, I couldn't get rid of you. That's what Padmini must tell Kapila. She should say more without concealing anything. Kapila, if that Rishi had given me to you, would I have gone back to Devdatta some day exactly like this? But she doesn't say anything. She remains silent. Right? So she remains silent. She's not very sure. Her desire for the two men remains, and it's not very clear what would have happened if the reverse had happened. If she had chosen the body with Kapila's head and Devdatta's body, what would have happened? So the two men remain substitutable. They remain substitutes. They remain interchangeable to each other for Padmini's desire. You also see the influence that the body has on the mind. Right? So when Kapila says, this body is mine, right? She says, he talks about his own body, Devdatta's body, which has been transformed by his hard labor. He talks about the memories that his body has. The body of his, Devdatta's body, bears the memories of Padmini's touch. So he says, one beats the body into shape, but one can't beat away the memories trapped in it. Isn't that surprising that the body should have its own ghosts, its own secrets, memories of touch, memories of a touch, memories of a body swaying in these arms, of a warm skin against this palm, memories which one cannot recognize, cannot understand, cannot even name because this head wasn't there when they happened. Right? So the body isn't subordinate to the head. It also seems to have its own autonomous life, its own bodily memory. Right? So the body can remember the touch of Padmini, but the head cannot. And later on, when Devdatta and Kapila meet, they realize that they have both been transformed by their heads and their bodies. they almost begin to resemble each other, but then they realize that they have betrayed each other. They are not able to live with each other in themselves. Right? So, Kapila is not able to bear the fact that he has Devadatta's body, and Devadatta is not able to bear the fact that he has Kapila's body, and that they have both been transformed by the transposition, and the fact that they both desire Padmini and Padmini desires both of them. So, that it is not possible for them to live together. Right? So, they end up having a fight, a duel, in which they end up killing each other. So, they are unable to actually reconcile the dilemma between head and body, and they end up killing each other, and Padmini herself burns herself on the funeral pyre by committing sati. But since sati is traditionally meant to be performed by the faithful wife of a man who has died, a woman who proclaims or claims her fidelity to her husband, here the sati is Padmini, who is committing a sati for the two men, both of whom she loved and desired. Thus, the Bhagavata says, thus Padmini became a sati. India is known for its pativratas, wives who dedicated their whole existence to the service of their husbands, but it would not be an exaggeration to say that no pativrata went in the way Padmini did, and yet no one knows the spot where she performed sati. If you ask the hunting tribes that dwell in these forests, they only point to a full blossomed tree of the fortunate lady. It's the same flower, the same flowering tree that Padmini had admired earlier on their trip to the Ujjain fair, and when she asks Kapila to bring her the flower from the tree. They say that even now on full moon and on new moon nights, a song rises from the roots of the tree and fills the whole forest like a fragrance. So, in some sense, this is also a satire, a parody of the very ritual of sati, which is meant to be conducted, performed by a wife who is faithful to her only husband. And the play is framed, as I mentioned earlier, by Hayavadana's predicament as a symbol of the post-colonial subject, where again he reappears towards the end of the play, desperately trying to get rid of all human signs. So he is not able to get rid of his voice, and he can only use his voice to sing the national anthem. They are also left with Padmini's son, who has been abandoned and orphaned by the death of his parents, and the predicament of the son is also like the predicament of Hayavadana, because he is also the future of the nation. He symbolizes the future of the nation, right? So Hayavadana does not know what the future has in store, right? Because he becomes that hybrid post-colonial subject who is disillusioned with the future, right? And has lost the romanticism, the excitement of the freedom struggle, and is the legatee of a hybrid legacy, right, of the colonial and the indigenous. Right. So he says that he had actually begged a goddess to make him complete, and the goddess appeared very prompt and looked rather put out. She said rather peevishly, I thought, "Why don't you people go somewhere else if you want to chop off your stupid heads? Why do you want to come to me?" I fell at her feet and said, "Mother, make me complete." She said, "So be it," and disappeared. And so that's the goddess Kali makes Hayavadana into a horse, but a horse with a human voice that is condemned to chant or sing only the patriotic songs or the national anthem. Thank you.